Hello, it's James Holland here on We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Now, this is one of our little specials we do from time to time, and what a special one it was too, because earlier today I went to see General Stuart Watson, who'd been in the 13th, 18th Hussars during the Second World War, landed on Sword Beach on D-Day, fought all the way through the Normandy campaign, then was part of 30 Corps' drive up towards Arnhem and Operation Market Garden, fought away all the way through those winter campaigns of 1944 and 1945, and was in northern Germany at the beginning of May when the war finally ended. His is an amazing story, and he's an absolutely delightful fellow. And I've got to say, I could have sat there and listened to him all day, but I hope you enjoy it. So, Stuart, it's thank you very much for talking to me. And before we sort of get on to the details of your wartime career, I'm fascinated to know about where you were born and brought up, and how you came to join the Hussars. So you were at school. You were brought up in York, and you went to school in Aysgarth to start off with,
yes.
And then you moved.
No, we moved when I first went to school.
Right.
At that time, we moved in 31.
So you'd have been what, 7?
I was about 8, I think. 8
Right,
or 9.
right. Yeah.
I was born in 22. And I was there for 5 years, boarding. Do you want to know about that?
Well, a little bit.
Well,
How were you in your studies? Were
born.
you a good student?
I think not bad. I was head of the school in the end.
Well, yeah, that's pretty impressive. Signs of early signs of leadership
Or
skills.
Something. Yeah. It was a good school, and I enjoyed it. And then I went to Winchester, partly because, of course, in those days people went a long way to school.
Yeah.
Nowadays you just go around the corner.
Right.
But I went there largely because the headmaster of the prep school was a Wykehamist.
Right. So he had links.
So he had links and encouraged people to go there.
Yeah.
And I went there in 36 and stayed until 41.
And how was were you a sportsman as well?
Not exceptionally. I mean, I played squash and tennis, and we played all the usual games.
Yeah.
And then in 41, of course, we were called up. And I was called up more or less on my 19th birthday.
Were you? Was that a telegram? Or, I mean, how did that come? Or was that just a letter from the War Office?
Well, they just said, you're the next lot to be called up.
Yeah, right. I'm presuming you knew it was coming.
Oh, yes. And I went to Catterick.
But I mean, how did you feel about that? I mean, were you sort of up for it, or was there a sort of sense of... I mean, I imagine if it had been me, I'd like to think I'd have accepted it, but I would have it would have felt like a bit of a sort of dead weight of dread.
No, I don't think it did, because everybody was in we were all in it together, as some people have said. So it was coming right from the start. We knew it was going to happen. The first sort of effect of the war, in a way, on me was in 1938, Munich time, when people thought the war was about to break out anyway.
Yeah.
And our dormitory in Winchester looked over the main road to Southampton.
Right.
And for several days, several nights, there was just massive traffic, military traffic, going down to Southampton in 1938.
Right.
And then, of course, they said peace in our time and all that stuff.
Yeah. So there was a real sense that the nation was gearing up for war.
Oh, yes, yes. And then they built an air raid shelter at the house in Winchester. I think all the houses had air raid shelters. And when I say air raid shelters, I mean proper things. And we slept
sort of concrete bunkers underneath the ground.
Yes, and we slept there quite a lot. Not every night, but in 1940 we used to sleep there pretty well every night. I bet.
Well, you must have heard the bombing of Southampton and Portsmouth and so on.
I suppose so. Mainly was the effect was hearing the aeroplanes flying, the German aeroplanes flying over, going up to the Midlands and that kind of thing.
Right.
Going up to Coventry and all these places.
So you're lying in your bed, you can hear them thundering over, can you?
You couldn't hear them in the air raid shelter.
Right.
But you knew there was German air traffic.
Yeah.
And in late 1940 it was quite constant.
I mean, was there a sense of anger or excitement or?
Well, of course, the first dramatic thing that happened was Dunkirk, which is a bit depressing.
And again, if you're in Winchester, you'd have presumably seen trains.
Yes, well, we saw people coming back a bit. Yeah, they mostly, of course, came by train actually, except the local ones. But that was the first sort of drama in a way.
And are you all reading the news? Do you have that sort of facility at Winchester?
Yes. Well, certainly reading the paper. I suppose we had a radio. We must have, I think. No television, of course.
So was your last term wasn't the summer term of 1940? It was 41.
No, I left in summer term 41.
Right.
Helped to the Home Guard a bit.
Did you? Was that a school one? Or back at home?
No, that was at home. It was a local Home Guard unit, which was run by the old and bold, really. I mean, the commanding officer was about 65, I think. It was quite interesting, really, because he'd been a regular soldier, and he had one or two sort of things which he bothered about. I mean, he set up his headquarters quite near where we were living. And I remember vividly that he was always worrying about headed postcards. Anyway, we got some headed postcards in the end. But people were quite enthusiastic about it. We got involved at the beginning, my brother and I, in receiving evacuees.
Right.
And our evacuees came from Hull.
Right.
Which was about 40 miles away. They mostly came by train. Some of them came by bus, I think. And there were 2 days. The first day was children over 5 with teachers, with 1 case each and a gas mask. And that was about it. And they came to the village, and the parish council were all formed up in their best kit to receive them. And they were sent out to farms and things around the village.
Yeah. Where there's a bit of room, presumably.
Where there was quite a lot of room. I don't know how many we had. I think we might have had 50, something like that, in the village.
Well, come to the village.
Yes.
Yeah.
And my brother and I'd just passed the driving test about a fortnight before. So we drove.
What were you driving? What were your first wheels?
Well, my father had a Singer.
Did he?
It was quite the car didn't last very long. It was very good, actually, but he changed his car every year pretty well, which people did rather than those days.
Yeah.
And it was an open car. He always had a thing with a let-down roof. Anyway, we drove them out to these farms and things, and of course they'd never been in the country before. They didn't know really about things like cows.
Right. Yeah.
And one of the farms, which was near where we were actually living, through a sort of park, and they had to come that way. They had to walk that way to get to school, which they found rather worrying because they'd written about cows or anything.
Right. Yeah. Right.
They'd never eaten butter, for instance. Anyway, they came with teachers, with the odd teacher, 1 teacher to, I suppose, 12 children or something like that.
Yeah.
And went to the village school. But quite a lot of them went, and then the second day was mothers and smaller children, up to the age of 5. It was an amazing operation. I mean, you think of the thousands and thousands in the country who were being evacuated.
Yeah.
In 2 days.
Extraordinary.
And it worked very well on the whole. It certainly did in our part of it. It may have been more difficult in the cities, I think.
So what was the mood in your household? I mean, were you kind of was it sort of weary resignation that you were having to help out, or was there a sort of sense of excitement about it all?
No, I think people were quite interested.
Right. Sort of social experiment almost.
Yes, more or less. Of course, my parents had been in the First War. My father was in the army in the First War.
Oh, right. Where had he served?
Well, he was a sapper.
Right.
And had he
been on the Western Front or elsewhere?
No, he didn't. He only went to front. He was rarely in the transport side. He ran the railways.
Right.
I mean, he ran.
Of course, he was a railway man. Right.
He ran a railway anyway, and that went on for about a couple of months, I suppose. And then I was called up in October.
Yeah.
And I went to Catterick.
And it's call-up time.
And it's call-up time. So I was called up then, and we went to a training regiment in Catterick.
And it was always going to be army, was it? There was no thoughts of joining the RAF or Navy.
No, it didn't occur really. I mean, they said, come here, and I went there. So
right.
To the army.
But if they'd said, report to Portsmouth or Dartmouth,
no, they wouldn't have. They would have offered it. I mean, if you said, I don't want to go in the army, I want to go in the Navy, you probably could have done.
Right.
But I didn't arise.
Right.
So we were in Catterick for only about 3 weeks. It was incredibly cold.
Yeah, it's a bleak old place up there, isn't it?
But it was even colder than that.
Yeah. What is amazing about the wartime years, which worked massively against the fighting armies, was that it was just miserable winter after miserable winter.
Yes, it was.
I mean, they were brutal, those winters of the Second World War.
That one was 41. Was particularly cold. I mean, we went up in October, and it snowed. It did actually snow.
Did it really?
Yeah. Not much.
Yeah.
It did. And then they said, well, we don't need so many training regiments, and they folded it up, the Armoured Corps Regiment in Catterick. And we moved to Tidmouth.
So already you knew you were going to do armour, did you?
Yes, it was an Armoured Corps training regiment.
Right, but you had no say in this. It just happened, or did you have a choice? Because, I mean, if you join the army, presumably you can say, I'd rather be infantry or engineer.
Yes, I suppose we did. I don't remember making it, but yes, I think we must have done.
Okay.
And that lasted when I got to Tidmouth. That was November. And I was eventually, I did what wasn't called an RCB in those days, but it was a similar thing.
So this is the commission board?
Yes. I went to Octu. Sandhurst in those days was mainly infantry.
Yeah.
Infantry cadets.
Because there were Octus all over the place, weren't they? Well, not all over the place, but they were.
Well, there were lots.
Yeah.
The Armoured Corps had 3.
Right.
One at Sandhurst, one at Blackdown, and one somewhere else.
Presumably one was the one down south in sort of Bovington way, in Dorset.
No, the most southerly one was Blackdown, Camberley. We then went to a so-called pre-Octu.
Right.
Which was simply filling in time.
Right.
In the vacancies in the Octu. And all we did was sort of drill and weapon training. That's all.
Right.
And that was about a month, I think. And then I went to Sandhurst. And in those days, the Sandhurst course, Sandhurst was mainly infantry, but it had a so-called armoured wing.
Yeah.
And we actually had tanks and things.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
And what were they? Sort of old Valentines and Matildas and things?
Yes, and Covenanters.
Right, yeah.
And we used to go out and do a bit of sort of troop training on Blackdown, out just outside Camberley. That was 4 months. And I actually went to Richmond in December.
Right.
On commission.
Right.
My Sovereign's Parade was beginning of December. And they were then in Skipton, in Yorkshire.
And at what point did you join the 13th 18th Hussars?
December the 4th that year.
Right, but had you already? So you finished Sandhurst. You're commissioned second lieutenant.
Yeah.
Are you then told you're going to the 13th 18th Hussars, or have you already got that lined up before?
I originally thought I was going to the Skins.
Right.
And for various reasons that fell through.
Okay.
Luckily. And it so happened as the contact officer for the 13th 18th at Sandhurst,
right,
sort of looked after the regiment's interests, said, why don't you come to my regiment? So I said, well, okay. That was the 13th 18th. Right. So anyway, on the 4th of December, I think it must have been, I reported to Skipton,
right,
Second Lieutenant Watson. And we were there until April.
And straight in as a troop commander, presumably?
Yes. I had 2 Covenanters and a Crusader.
Right. Amazing.
And we did quite intensive training. We used to do a lot of night driving and all that sort of thing.
Right. And as an officer, when you were doing your training, I mean, did you train to do all things? You know, I mean, as an officer, do you need to know how to fire and load and drive and all that kind of stuff? And
well, I'd done that before. I mean,
right.
I'd done that at the training regiment.
Did you quite enjoy it?
Yes. We had a rather fierce commanding officer, but he was extremely good. Brilliant trainer. And he no doubt trained the regiment extremely well. He didn't come to Normandy because he was ill,
right,
and missed out 6 weeks before.
Right.
Which was bad luck, because he missed out on British Expeditionary Force as well.
Because the 13th, 18th, had they been in France?
In the BEF, yeah.
They had been in the BEF.
Yeah.
So they then came back,
With
reconstituted,
light tanks.
yeah, built themselves up.
Yeah.
So before they went to Normandy, the 13th, 18th hadn't been in action since 1940.
No, that's right. When we were in 9th Armoured Division when I joined the British, which was an ordinary armoured division, 2 brigades. And then when we got to Skipton, we were still in 9th Armoured. And then in about April, we transferred into 79th Armoured. And we had Valentine's at that stage.
Right.
And we moved to Suffolk.
Right. What did you make of the Valentine?
Well, it served its purpose, but it was terribly slow and rather thin and a hopeless gun.
So not a lot going for it.
So it wasn't a great tank. But it served its purpose for us, of course, because it was DD.
Yep.
Anyway, we went. I think we took the Covenanters and things to Suffolk, and then re-equipped with Valentine for the summer.
So is this North Suffolk? Because in that area around there, there's quite a lot of
Wickham Market.
Yeah, because there's quite a lot of sort of heathland there, isn't there?
Well, Orford.
Yeah.
Was a training area. It was close to civilians,
okay.
and we used to train.
And coastal, so you could do.
Yes, and of course nobody else could get anywhere near the coast because it was all sealed off.
Yeah, of course.
But we had this quite big training area north of Orford, sort of behind Aldborough, that sort of way.
Yeah, I know.
And we trained.
Actually, it's a very nice part of the world, isn't it?
Oh yes, and I knew it extremely well because we always went to Aldborough for holidays. So that took us up to. We did quite extensive training. I mean, brigade level training.
Yeah. Did you? So at brigade level, does that mean you're training? Are you training at all with infantry and artillery?
Yes.
So it is all arms training.
Yes.
That's really good, isn't it?
Yeah. We didn't start swimming until November.
November 43. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but by this point, you're starting to be re-equipped with Shermans.
No.
No.
We did it all with Valentines.
DD training and Valentines.
Yes. The Shermans didn't arrive until about 6 weeks before D-Day because they weren't ready.
No, yeah.
Americans were building them,
hurtling off the production lines in Detroit or whatever.
Yes, yeah. So we did all the exercises with Valentines there, and then we stayed there until.
And you knew this was for the invasion. This is what you were building up towards.
Yes, nobody said so, but it clearly was.
Right. You all sensed it. You all knew.
And everybody knew what they were doing. Well, they knew that they were going somewhere. Of course, we didn't know where.
No.
We didn't know where until much later on.
No.
Until the D-Day, really. And then we went up and started DD training in Norfolk, Fritton Lakes, just behind Lowestoft. And that lasted about a month. We swam in Fritton Lakes.
And how did you find it? I mean, it must have been deeply unnerving, wasn't it? I mean, because, everything about a tank suggests that it's big and heavy, and the moment you put it in water, it's going to sink.
And doesn't swim.
And doesn't swim. So, there is a certain sort of leap of faith, presumably, when you do it for the first time.
Yes, it was quite, yes. And we had the Davis escape apparatus, which actually wouldn't have worked because it would have worked for the people who weren't in the turret, in the tank, if they hadn't been able to get out.
No.
Because it was too big. And
Right.
they designed a new escape apparatus on the same system as the Davis one, called the amphibious tank escape apparatus, which was much smaller.
Yeah, a lovely ring to it.
The board around your neck.
Right.
Anyhow, so that was quite. The only dramatic thing about that was that the brigadier came out one night and went in one of the tanks and ran out of petrol.
Presumably not while he was in the middle of a lake.
Well, it was in the lake. Yes.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes, he was absolutely. Yeah.
So what happened? Did it sink?
I can't. No, it just stopped. And a great number of people given serious rockets.
I can well imagine.
We went to Dumfriesshire.
Up in Scotland?
Yeah. The most ghastly place called Holdham Castle, which was appalling.
And how do you get up there? Is it all sort of pile onto trains?
Yes.
And presumably all the tanks are on kind of low wagons and off you go.
They were taken by train, largely.
Yeah.
And they were all sort of typical military moves. I mean, they took place first thing in the morning or last thing at night. And all that sort of thing. Anyway, we went to Holdham Castle for, I think, about a month and didn't really do very much there. And it was overrun with rats. It was really ghastly. And then we went up to Fort George, near Inverness, and were there from I suppose, the end of January. Something like that, beginning of February.
So did you ever do actually DD training in the sea, or was it all lakes and things?
No, we did it in the sea.
You did it in the sea?
It was lakes in November.
Yep. When you first started doing it in Suffolk.
Then when we went to Scotland, it was in the sea.
Wow.
In the muddy firth.
Crikey.
On a big scale, 3 days of exercises. Quite intensive. And we lived in Fort George.
I mean, did you ever, did you lose any men during these exercises? Or any tanks or anything?
I think we lost a tank in Norfolk. I don't think we lost any in Scotland. Don't remember that we did.
Right. And by this time, presumably, you're all kind of working pretty cohesively, camaraderie has been established, you know all your men.
Yes.
You're getting a feel for what it's like being a commander and an officer. And
then I became signals officer at that stage.
Okay.
After we got to Scotland. So I'd done the DD training in Norfolk. I didn't do any DD training in Scotland, I don't think. Although regimental headquarters, which I was in, would have been in DDs.
Right.
Until Monty changed the plan.
Right.
When he came back from the Middle East and took over 21st Army Group, he changed the plan.
Yeah.
For another thing, and instead of being the whole brigade, it was only 2 regiments, and it was only 2 squadrons in each of the armed regiments with DDs, and the 3rd squadron and RHQ were landed over the beach. Anyhow, we stayed up there until April, and then the DD squadrons A and B went to Gosport, and the rest of us went to Petworth.
Petworth. In Sussex.
Yes, in the Petworth House grounds, tented camp.
Yeah.
And of course the place was absolutely seething with troops.
I can imagine.
Every space was occupied by some kind of unit. And a lot of security and all that sort of thing. And again, quite intensive training, but mostly the DDs. And at that stage, I suppose it must have been in April, I think we got the Shermans.
Right. And we were all pretty happy to have them?
Oh yes, they were very good. Much better, quite a different story from the Valentines. They went quite quickly. They had a better gun. Not a very exceptional gun, but a better gun.
But you did have a stabilising gun gyro on it as well.
Yes, oh yes.
That's quite sophisticated. German tanks didn't have that.
No. And a crew of 5, an amazing engine.
Yeah.
A Canadian 2-stroke diesel.
Is that what you had in your one?
Yeah. Well, they all had them.
Yeah.
Except the DDs, which had petrol engines.
Right.
5 Chryslers arranged in a circle.
Yeah, these multi-banks.
Yeah. And of course they had burst into flames if you looked at them more or less. That was the problem. One of the problems with those Shermans, that they did burst into flames, but they'd pretty well gone within days of D-Day and been replaced with diesel ones. They couldn't float the diesel one.
Right.
It wouldn't float. The balance was wrong or something.
Okay.
But they did this very well. They never broke down. They were very easy to maintain.
And so presumably by this stage, by the time you're in Petworth, you know that it's that whatever it is you're going to be doing is getting closer.
Yeah. Oh yes. And then very few people were allowed to know anything. The commanding officer and the adjutant and squadron leaders knew a certain amount a few weeks before D-Day.
Right.
But they didn't know where they were going.
Right.
And we had these fake maps.
Right. And what was the
Caen, for instance, was on these maps was Poland. That was the code word for Caen. We didn't actually know until we got into the OCTs.
Really?
The security was absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah.
Well, it just was an incredible plan.
It sort of had to be, didn't it?
And it did, and it was. It worked. The Germans hadn't any idea.
And what was the kind of, before you head off across the English Channel, what can you remember any sense of what the mood was like? Were you...
It was quite upbeat in a way.
It was. Do you remember the pep talk by Monty?
No, I don't actually. I can't remember when he came and saw us in Scotland. I remember that. I remember what he said. That I suppose was our pep talk, as it were.
Yeah.
He was late. I remember he was late, and he was wearing a very dirty British warm. And it was the usual thing, gather round and all that stuff. And he stood on front of it.
But did you feel can you remember? What your reaction to it was? Did you think, oh great, He knows what he's about, or
Oh, yes.
you felt reassured.
He came with a good reputation, of course,
Yeah,
having won Alamein and all that.
right. But you felt reassured by what he said.
Yes,
did you?
yes. He's a strange man, but yes, the answer is yes to that question.
Right.
He came, I suppose he must have talked for 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And there must have been 2 or 3 regiments formed up in the barracks. And I don't think we saw him again until Normandy, and then he appeared from time to time. Not very often. We mainly saw the Corps Commander. He came pretty regularly. I mean, he would come, we'd see him about once a fortnight. It was a chap called Bucknell,
Okay.
who Monty didn't approve of.
Right.
And as soon as Horrocks was fit, because Horrocks had been wounded, and
Then he was- then
Monty
Horrocks was
said,
brought back.
"Well, I want Horrocks."
I think he came back in about August.
And he came back and had 48 hours every month in Monty's headquarters to recover from, because he'd been wounded quite badly. He was an inspiring figure.
Who, Horrocks or Bucknell?
No, Horrocks.
Yeah.
I mean, some people couldn't do with him. They thought he was bogus. And that's slightly reflected in that recent book, Beaver, was it?
Yeah.
And he was
Anthony's a bit, it has to be said, Anthony's a little bit down on Monty and
Yes, he
his
certainly was.
commanders. I know, it's mean of us to tantalisingly leave you there on the eve of D-Day, but please do join us again next week, because next Thursday we'll be bringing out the second part of my interview with Stuart Watson, and he will be landing on D-Day on Sword Beach, I can promise you. So join us then. Cheerio for now.